Frogs. What was that? Blood turning to water, the frogs, flies, and gnats or lice, right? And we ended a note on how we all yearn for creation. And I think there's a really big theme here that is God is undoing that which he created. And you can see how quickly just one little thing in your environment can turn your world to chaos, right? So over and over, we're going to see God and maybe battling those gods of Pharaohs or the Egyptians, showing his true power and what he created and what he's really in control of. And that includes everything from their hygiene to their food supply to their well-being to their, economy. Their GDP is getting hit here. And maybe that's an interesting side point for why doesn't Pharaoh want to let these people go? Well, he is hard-headed, but there's a reason he's hard-headed. They make a lot of things for the Egyptian people. Yep. All right. So here's an interesting question. We'll spend a few minutes here, and this may feel like we backed up into 7 and 8, but were the Egyptian magicians able to replicate any of the plagues? Okay, lay down the snakes with the staffs. Anything else? They turned water to blood. And they conjured up some frogs. So y'all got 3 of them here. So the magicians respond. And we talked about these 3 examples. Y'all got them all right. What do y'all think about this? Is it a cheap parlor trick? Is it a sleight of hand? Did the Egyptians have some dark form of magic back in the day? Ian?
I think there's reasonable evidence to prove that there's some dark magic going on here, some capabilities. I can't remember, a couple sermons ago, Daniel was referencing where I think we talk about like exorcism, right? And the fact that there was like a reference to like dark magic, and there people were practicing exorcism. So I think this is way beyond my scope of understanding, right? I'm just giving you my opinion. I think that there very well could have been, and at play today even, this dark magic, right? The opposite side of God, right, has power too, and you can fall into that trap, I think.
I think you said something really key there, and I would agree with you. There could have been. We don't know. We know the witch at Endor. There's lots of warnings against practicing this kinds of stuff. There was something in their world that we don't have. Whether it was actual magic or not, I'm not here to say. But there is a dark force acting upon this world. But I think what is so key is that wherever it comes from, it might as well have been a cheap trick, right? If it was just a sleight of hand that they were able to do this, or some other craftery, or it was Satan's power that they were using to be able to do this, anything in that swath is a cheap trick compared to God's power. And that's what they learned very quickly. We'll go to the next slide in just a second. I will say this about the 9 first plagues, is there's 3 groupings that are pretty interesting. In each grouping, there's 3 plagues. It's starting anew because God tells Moses, in the morning, go to Pharaoh and say, and I'm going to give you a new plague, and you're going to give him forewarning. I think the first, number 1 and number 4, you see tomorrow about this time, or some language like that. So there's forewarning in the morning, and so we've reset. The second one There, it doesn't say in the morning, it says go to Pharaoh. And there is forewarning. And then the third one comes out of nowhere. No context, no forewarning, no nothing, and then the pattern resurfaces. And then these first three, the first three in that column, 1, 2, 3, the blood, the frogs, and the lice, what do you see here about the development of the magicians here? And maybe more importantly, Pharaoh's response to these magicians. We're coming, Terry. 1 second.
Yes, it was the thing about the lice or the gnats is that the magicians realized that this was not, they could not do that particular plague. Well, to them they did do the other two, the blood and the frogs out of the river, that sort of thing. So.
Yep, absolutely. So we find out, and we'll get to this. I guess we'll flip over to this slide now. In these first three, they try. They try the blood, they try the frogs, and they get to the gnats, and they can't do it, right? And what it's on the slide here. What is their reply to the gnats that are all over the people? The finger of God. That's right. They are acknowledging God. Does anybody remember our discussion on why God is doing all of this? I mean, there's the underlying reason of redeeming his people, but I think there's something more profound going on here. They will know God. They will know his power. They will know his name. They will know what he can do. And more importantly, they will know that he is way above all the other gods, right? And so that's that first set of three there. And then we come back to the fourth plague, and in the morning, you're going to go talk to Pharaoh. We're going to give him a warning, and that gets us through the end of 8 here. I will say, for the flies and gnats and the livestock, it brings us into chapter 9, where we're really digging into today. The Egyptians took their hygiene very seriously. And for these things to invade their lives like this was a personal affront. And it's at that same time that the personal affront really comes into play that they start to change their tune. The magicians, we'll see the advisors, we'll see people actually running away or hiding from the plagues. Once these things start to impact me, I start to pay attention. And I guess there's something to that, and that is what? Like God could be trying to tell me something, and I'm not going to listen till it costs me something, till I get the hard knock lesson. I think surely there's some of that going on here. And so we get into chapter 9, and the first plague in this chapter, the fifth plague, is the death of the livestock. And what's significant about this plague? It didn't happen to the Hebrews. And I think we're going to see this a little more, but what does that signify to the Egyptian people? Somebody's favored. Somebody's liked in this situation, and someone is not, right? God is preferencing them, and all of their livestock died. Do you think if you're an advisor to Pharaoh in this situation, 5 plagues is enough? What are you telling Pharaoh at this point? Yeah. Okay, this is hitting me in the pocketbook. This is causing me sickness and hygiene issues, and your people are going to revolt against. You're worried about GDP? You're worried about the economy here? Your livestock all just died. The balance, the weight is really shifting here, and yet we continue to see that Pharaoh hardens his heart. One more note here on the magician's failure is now that we move into the boils, and this is physical affirmity, what do we see? They don't even try. They couldn't even stand before Moses. And so as we get to this point in the narrative, Pharaoh loses even the ability or the effort to try to match what Moses is doing. I think it's really interesting to think about Pharaoh in these first three. Is like, oh, well, my magicians can do that. How powerful is this God? But he's lost that as of the sixth plague here, which comes without warning. Any thoughts about this before we go on? Yeah, Ian.
I just think it's a good example here of looking at Pharaoh and his response even after they've lost all their livestock, which if you think about it is in this time in history, agriculture and livestock were everything. I mean, that was your basically the totality of your wealth was centralized in those two things. So you lose those, you basically have no economy, but yet he's still stubborn, right? And in the last class, we talked about how God will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I think it's a good example of that's a real slippery slope. Once you start to reject God and what God is telling you need to do, it can quickly go to the point where you're totally rejecting anything God says or does.
Well, he's not even paying attention to math at this point, right? Surely the math equation is slipping away from him very quickly. We see this accumulate in the next plague, the hail. I don't know. Maybe I should have put it in the slide deck. That just occurred to me. There was about 3 weeks ago, there was a huge storm down in Neville out by our way, and I saw pictures of people's front yards with mounds of hail, like things you wouldn't. I would never have comprehended it, and it destroyed cars, and it was pretty aggressive, and it was just interesting that the storm came so close to home, and it coincided with us having this class right now. I got to see something firsthand of just the destruction. I don't think that's a surprise to us. We all understand what hail could be if it was big enough and bad enough, and not just hail. What was mixed in with it? Maybe we could say lightning of fire, like bolts of fire were coming down with the hail. Is that normal weather phenomenon? No. In fact, what do we see in the text here? Well, let's read some here. Let's start in verse 18 of chapter 9. Behold, tomorrow about this time I will cause very heavy hail to rain down, such as has not been in Egypt since its founding until now. Therefore, send now and gather your livestock and all that you have in the field, for the hail shall come down on every man and every animal which is found in the field, and it is not brought home, and they shall die. He who feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh made his servants and his livestock flee to the houses. But he who did not regard the word of the Lord left his servants and his livestock in the field. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be hail in the land of Egypt, on man, on beast, and on every herb of the field throughout the land of Egypt. And Moses stretched out his rod toward the heaven, and the Lord sent thunder, and hail and fire darted to the ground, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, so that very heavy that there was none like it in all of the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And the hail struck throughout the whole land of Egypt, and that was the field, but all that was in the field, both man and beast, and the hail struck every herb and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were there no hail. So what do we see here again in this passage? There's something new, actually, but something we just talked about. Yeah, anything left roaming around, I guess, was taken out by the hail. Yeah, Jordan.
I was going to say just another example of, I think you mentioned this at the intro class, that when God sent Moses and Aaron back to start this arguing this case to Pharaoh, frankly, he didn't necessarily have the support of the elders of the Israelites and whatnot. But then, as we've seen, it looks like apparently some of the Egyptians are now turning course, at least heeding the words of Moses and Aaron. You mentioned a second ago about after the fourth plague, them pointing, hey, this has to be the finger of God, the magicians. And now we see some of the everyday Egyptians at least took notice and thought, you know what, maybe we need to listen to this. So you see almost like a progression, if you will, of the turning of maybe even some of the Egyptian populace.
Could you expound upon that, about the normal, godless human being in light of these events? I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be Jordan, but I think Jordan's spot on here. But what did the normal person do that was paying any attention? They started listening. They brought their livestock in, their slaves in. I mean, there's something pretty dark going on here, right? The slaves of other nations who the Egyptians kept in the field, what happened to them? Whose fault was that? Was that God's in the hail? Why the Egyptians? Why was it their fault? They didn't listen. They didn't believe the Lord was who he said it was. How could you not at this point? But yeah, Albert.
So the phrase you use, they didn't listen, is 100% correct, I think. And another way is they denied his mercy. God is showing about himself, and he's showing, I am a merciful God, and I'm not just about these people in Goshen. I'm showing you that I am someone to be followed. I think kind of gives insight to those who aren't understanding about God's plural lowercase in God. Mm-hmm. This is, to me, an example of God's mercy extended. And again, it's up to us to accept or deny it.
Were there anyone among the Hebrews that weren't Hebrews when they left Egypt? Yeah, there were. Maybe we'll study that a little more as we get into this. But anyone who wanted to listen to God, anyone who wanted to know who God's name was accepted by God throughout all of the Old Testament. And we see that same narrative coming true throughout the New Testament. All right, anything else here? Man, what a plague, right? How are we doing? We're through, I guess we're through 7 of them. We're only going to get through 9. And so is there anything left? Is there anything left to take down? I mean, we were talking about the economy earlier. Yeah, hygiene, labor, agriculture, livestock, anything you'd use to make money. Whatever Pharaoh wanted. In one alternate timeline, they're building Pi Ramses, which is mentioned in the first chapter, for Ramses to have his capital city and move up from the south. Is that city worth it if your people can't survive, if they can't live, if they don't have crops, if they don't have livestock? Well, and how might Pharaoh be haughty in this? We get through the hail. How might he be haughty at this point?
Maybe he has storehouses of grain.
Yeah, where did they learn that lesson, right? I think that it's not here in the text, but I think that's highly probable. Yeah, Albert.
Stubborn belief that his gods are going to eventually kick in, possibly.
Yeah, I think that he is a god too, right? Or at least he needs his people to believe that. That's such a fascinating concept. You imagine I can imagine convincing everyone else that you're deity. Can you imagine in your own head believing that you actually are? I can't at all. But Jordan, what's going on?
Well, so I was going to maybe expound upon Albert's point then. And forgive me for going there, but like verse 27. So there's starting to be a pattern of Pharaoh saying, okay, I messed up, give us reprieve. And then that happens, and they immediately go. So it's like almost like a child. And I think like Theo, hey, do this. Like, okay, you know what I mean? It's like I'll do this until something else. You stop doing this, right?
That's
and then I'm
right.
going back to doing what I want to do. So maybe that's what maybe to Albert's point. That's maybe Pharaoh to a certain degree is, hey, at some point, my gods have to kick in. So if I can wait it out at whatever cost, maybe that's the end game.
Yeah. Well, imagine writing your whole bank balance over, and Friday night you're in the hospital with your child, and you make any promise to God, and Sunday morning comes and you got to write that check, and you wonder how you're going to pay rent. You can see some of that in this story here, and God is saying, "Trust me, trust my process, and if you don't, there are real consequences." Yeah, Justin.
If I remember, if I remember right, I don't remember if it was discussed in here, or if I came across it somewhere else, but Egypt relied on the Israelites for a lot of their economy, if I remember right. So he could be of the mindset of like, look at everything that's happened, and I still haven't folded. What else can you do to me now? I'm not going to give up the foundation that my economy is built upon at this point, if I haven't yet. So he may be coming at it from that, thinking like, what else can you do at this point?
Maybe to Michael's point, we've prepared. We can withstand this storm a few more days. I think that's absolutely evident here. But what a passage here in 20 and 21, that whoever feared the Lord, does that mean they were righteous? Does that mean they did? No, they just had to listen and look around and say, oh, this is evident and this is true, and they were saved. Jordan mentioned a little bit about some of Pharaoh's response here. I mean, this isn't the first time, but we talked about his bargaining, like just do it here in the nation, and Moses says, oh, we'll be stoned. He starts to negotiate, okay, we'll go do it for 2 days, and we'll see in a minute. He says, you can go, but just take the men, or okay, take everybody, but don't take the livestock. So we see him like trying to placate without, he's hanging on to collateral one way or the other. And that's not what God has demanded. That's not what God is asking for. And I would guess he's getting a lot of advisement right now to let people go.
This may be a silly question, but do we know the amount of time we're talking about here from when this started to when it ended?
It seems to me to be in rapid succession. I don't know that there are some places where they say tomorrow this will happen, but the words then or then you will go or then this happened, it makes it seem pretty congruent. Yeah, Michael.
He may have also been kind of planning on using the livestock left in Goshen. Israel's stuff, like there's still resources there. We're going to be, as long as that, he still has some, I don't know, I'm just trying to like fathom like what's going on inside of his head as this keeps getting worse and worse.
Well, that's exactly what he says after the 9th plague, right? So we'll see that here in a minute, Michael. I think you're right. All right, so after the hail and fire, is there anything left? Clearly there's something. I wonder if this plague points to the fact that they had storehouses. Like, why is Pharaoh still so confident? What could be left after this hailstorm? Maybe it's the bits of food left on the stem that were left after the hail. Maybe it was storehouses. There's something there that the people are still relying on. And so we come to this passage in chapter 10 here, and we see God continuing to request to let the people go, and Pharaoh's not going to do it. And God says, "Okay, I'm going to send you. I'm going to send you locusts." He does give forewarning. What's the terminology? How will the locusts come? Five and 6, 10, 5 and 6 here. Yep. They shall fill your houses, the houses of your servants, the houses of all Egyptians. Never since the day the earth began to this day will there be anything like, has there been anything like this? This is going to be unprecedented. In the next verse, what do Pharaoh's servants say to him? We actually see this advisement coming out here. Let the men go. Let them go serve their God. Or do you not understand there's nothing left? And if this comes true, we will have nothing. There won't be anything. And so, of course, the locusts come. Pharaoh does not listen to even his own people. And as we think about the hardening of the heart, I've heard stubbornness. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The economics don't work. The politics don't work. The people around you are saying, don't do this. Do something different. Look at what's going on. And if all those things are pointing to God in our life, we should stop. We should evaluate ourselves for stubbornness, and we should look to move forward in a different path. Because Pharaoh doesn't do any of that. He doesn't see any reason. He only sees that he has said they can't go, and he's going to try to make that happen. So they come in, they eat every grain of everything everywhere, and Egypt is left in ruin, just as the advisors said they would be. And verse 19 and 20, Pharaoh called for Moses and said, I have sinned against the Lord. He's using the right words. I backed up a little bit. Verse 16, I have sinned against the Lord and against you. Now, therefore, please forgive my sin only this once, and entreat the Lord your God that he may take away from me this death only. So the Lord brings in a wind and takes out all of the locusts, and they move on. Is there anything left? What does Pharaoh have? Not much. I'm going to speculate for just a second here. There's not much written in, or maybe none that we know of, that's written in hieroglyphs about these great events. Well, could it be that there was so little resources and so much to do and so little availability for labor for things like art and hieroglyphs over the next 20, 30, 40 years that no one had time to do that? No one had time to write that. And that is speculative. But that's the extent in which God has brought Pharaoh and Egypt to its knees. There's nothing left. And so we see here that God has to bring on a ninth plague. And this is the third in the set of three, in the third set of three. And there's no warning for the darkness. I don't know, has anyone been researching this upcoming eclipse coming close to home for us? How long, does anybody know, if you've watched the little black circle go across Texas and Arkansas, as I have, trying to find a campsite that doesn't exist, how long is the complete 100% darkness going to be in the middle of that circle? At max 4 minutes long, right? This is maybe the closest thing we can experience to this, because supposedly if it's no clouds, you're going to be able to see some planets and some stars and things, and the darkness was so thick here that it could be felt. Have you ever been in an auditorium or somewhere where the lights are just off and the darkness is almost tangible? I don't know if that's a mental mind game or where that comes from, but that's what's going on here, right? And how long does it last for? 3 days. So you can't eat. You've had boils, you've had lice, you've had all these things. Your servants are dead, your cows are dead, your crops are dead, and you're sitting in Egypt and it's darkness for 3 days. Are you hungry? Are you tired? Yes. Are you hurting? Yes. Can you get food? No. Can you get medical help? You can't do any of these things, right? I mean, this is a pretty bleak picture, right? I mean, you almost want to ask here, can it get any worse? And maybe that's what Pharaoh said to himself. What else is there left to do? and we'll save that for next week, of course. But this 3-day darkness, it's not some eclipse, it's not some momentary thing that comes into play. It comes and it impacts the people. And so Pharaoh summoned Moses again, right? And as he repented, he says, "Get out of here. Take your people, but leave your flocks." This is right here, Michael, in verse 24, chapter 10, verse 24. Take your people, but leave your flocks. Well, Michael's already answered the question. There's no other cattle in the land, right? So if that leaves with the people, what do they have left? There's no herds for regrowing. There's nothing, right? There's no food. And what's Moses' response? It's like, these are ours. We deserve it. We have to eat if we're going to leave. He says, we have to sacrifice. This has never been in this narrative with Pharaoh about the people leaving Egypt. Now, that's the ultimate goal. We're going to get there. This is about a 3-day period of worship and sacrifice to God. And if they don't have their cattle, they can't do that. Pharaoh can't even let them go for 3 days. And what is Moses' response after he says that? Yep. Pharaoh says, "Get away from me, take heed to yourself, and see my face no more. For in the day you see my face, you shall die." Moses says, "You have spoken well. I will leave. I will never see your face again. We're out of here." So it took all of that. Of course, he leaves, and we'll get into this. The plagues aren't over, but Pharaoh and Moses are done talking from here on out. Any thoughts? I really wanted to play on the magicians and the advisors and the people of Egypt and how they advised Pharaoh throughout this whole process today. Are there any other thoughts on that or how he reacted or responded to them? All right. Pharaoh still didn't listen. I think he was probably being advised even at this point, just let him go, Pharaoh. So we're going to talk a little bit more. I think Jordan did a great job talking about God's role in hardening Pharaoh's heart last week. I know we didn't spend a ton of time on it. My conclusion is that of, there are places where it said early on that Pharaoh hardened his own heart and God doesn't do the hardening till later. Reminiscent of places like Romans 6 where it tells us that God gives us over to our own devices. It's kind of like you have a 6-year-old girl who doesn't want to wear a coat because she doesn't have the right color, and so you say, fine, go out and wear it anyways, and then she's miserable. I don't know where I got that example, but sometimes rather than fight, we allow lessons to be learned by what people around us want. And I don't think that that's that different than God in the narrative here. This hieroglyph is this depicting scenes from the Egyptians' Book of the Dead. And this is on the left side a heart, and on the right side of the scale a feather, and they're being weighed against each other. And there's 3 words for hardened in this in this Hebrew text. And I think it's important as we think about why Pharaoh's heart was hardened that we acknowledge that this isn't the same word over and over. There's actually quite a mixture of this. And this is what happens to a Pharaoh after death. Their heart is weighed against the feather, and if it's any heavier than the feather, then they have a lot of guilt, and the consequences of that will come. And so this is depicting that scene of a not so heavy heart. And this word is actually meant around maybe guilt or what you're carrying with you, in the heavy heart sense. And then we'll talk about another one we've heard it a lot this morning. People have said the word stubborn. This is the Hebrew word kaved, but it depicts this Egyptian scene very well, and that it was heavy. And so why would, early on, chapter 7, this is going back to last week, why would his heart be heavy? Well, this is pretty early on, right? He doesn't even acknowledge God, but he's contemplating the economics. You see here that he's putting people's life and well-being behind some of these other ideas of letting them go. He knows the history. The Egyptians had very good history. I think he knows what he's doing to the people, and he carries with him this sense of guilt. We see this a few more times in 8 and 9. So throughout the whole narrative of the plagues, we see this guilty version of the word hardened come up a couple of times. Can guilt ever get in our way? Can guilt ever harden us from pursuing what the Lord wants? Absolutely. Daniel talked about it this morning. If you think that God can't do it for you, if you think you're so far gone or so far bad, you're not trusting the power of the resurrection, right? And I think we see that here. I mean, God is making something new in this story, right? This isn't a whole different set of allegory. This is the same allegory. He's making his nation new. He's renewing his people to him and their relationship with him. And so I think that lays over very well with what's going on here. Yeah, Albert.
Something striking me is just we think of our president, or we think of democracy, we think of even today's the monarchy and their rise. Leadership was dictatorship, and it was taken over by might and taken over by deceit and killing a brother or killing a uncle or something. And there's a not good mental judgment in that time. And then, like we talk about being deity, and this is possibly a stretch, but with our own salvation, do we have a dictatorship in regards to our obedience and our submission to Christ? Do we are determined that we're going to get to heaven, but it's going to be our way on our terms, or the way I think it should be? And do we fight, and I think last week or so, kick against the goads?
Yeah. We'll even see Aaron's sons have similar thoughts, their strange worship their way, right? In not too distant future. Yeah, Rick.
Just one more thought about Pharaoh's heart. We read over in the book of James that God himself does not tempt anyone, but each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And if we read early on in the book of Exodus, when God is talking to Moses, he says, I know he won't let you go. So there's a good indication that God knows Pharaoh's heart.
Yeah.
And each time he gives him the opportunity to do the right thing and to listen. But within Pharaoh's heart is a good dose of pride, a good dose of, I want all this stuff. And he never does the right thing, even though God gives him the chance. So to me, that's important to realize that no, God is not tempting him to do or causing him to do bad, but because of Pharaoh's own internal desires, he's doing what he wants to do and is not turning around like he needs to. The other thing that comes to mind, I don't know if any of the Egyptian gods had ever spoken to Pharaoh before. Of course, he thought he himself was a deity, so he's probably got a pretty good impression of himself. So who is this Yahweh guy to tell me to do what I need to do? So I think there's a good dose of pride, good dose of economic focus, like you were saying. All these things enticed him to not do the right
Yep. Oh, absolutely. There's even, I was looking for it, there's one point where Moses tells Pharaoh, I know you're not going to hold up to your word. And so, I mean, God had clearly communicated that to Moses. I think you're absolutely right. These temptations, these guilts can weigh our heart from speedily turning around and repenting. I'm not going to try to pronounce this other word in Hebrew, but it is, it means strong, strengthened, maybe emboldened or stubborn, or like I'm going after it with robustness, right? So this is an emphasis on, and we see this more than the other version. And isn't this what we're all so capable of, and maybe what you were just expressing, Rick? We get started with ego, and we can't let it go. We get started with a lie. We have to dig in for some reason. And you know, if you're not involved in a lie and you're standing on the outside looking in, you could see the foolishness of that de-evolution of that decision. But when you're in it, when you're already tempted, when you're already in sin, when you're already ensnared, it seems like the heart's path is to strengthen, to be more resolute in the decision you made originally. And surely that's the case here with Pharaoh. Yeah, Ian.
Yeah, I think the difficulty here is for any of us in these types of situations is admitting, right, we've made bad choices and letting go of who we think we are, right? Because Pharaoh in this case would say, oh, I've made all these decisions. This is consistent with who I've been in the past. And if I change, I'm no longer going to have XYZ. I'm no longer going to have my power, the support of my people.
Right.
I'm no longer going to be looked at as deity. And you mentioned ego, and I think that's a perfect way to state it, because I've been told in the past, ego is edging God out. So you see, ego is all about the self and what I can do. Whereas here we see, if he would have clearly submitted to God, we know what God can do and what God would have allowed to happen if he did listen.
Absolutely. Oh man, we're not going to get through this. I'm not going to ask any questions. I had this thought that, was this a forewarning or was this the judgment on Pharaoh? And it is interesting to see here that there's a lot of and of course Moses is telling this story on both sides of the Exodus, right? But the staff swallows up the Egyptian staffs. We see the army is swallowed by the sea, same language. Water to blood. What do you think happens when the entire army gets swept up? Frogs covered the land. The same word. Sea covered the army. Frogs were piled up. Egyptians were piled up on the shore. Not one fly remained when Moses did away with the plague. Not one Egyptian remained when the Red Sea closed. Locusts were driven into the sea. Egyptians were driven into the sea. So I guess my point is, for the narrative of the story, was this the end judgment? I mean, we haven't even gotten to the 10th plague yet, but I don't think so. I think this was all pointing to, if you don't listen to me, these things are going to control your world. Conversely, they were a sign of deliverance. We have the same phrasing when the Israelites were out wandering in the wilderness. They found the bitter water, and God made it life-giving. God gave it the ability to be drank. Raining hail, raining bread. The same thing about the locust and manna is discussed with this phrase, came up and covered the land. These exact same words. And so Moses is going to continue to use these plagues to show God's power as a promise as well as a forewarning if you don't. So what are the two options there? You either listen to him and get the promise, or you don't listen to him and the plagues come about on you one way or the other. And we continue to see the plagues throughout the Old Testament used as a warning. You see this warning here in 28. He basically says, if you don't glorify me, which the Egyptians were accused of, you're going to get the plagues again. And so this would be served to be used as an ongoing reminder to the people. Listen to the Lord, trust Him. And we see something similar here. If that's a forewarning and not the judgment, then God had a lot of patience with Pharaoh, right? God had a lot of opportunities for Pharaoh to be redeemed and to show his observance of the Lord. And we see this here in 2 Peter 3 as it's attributable to us, this patience. The Lord is not slow in keeping His promise. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish. And I think if we take nothing else away from the plagues, this is it, right? Is there are opportunity after opportunity in our lives to stop, to repent, and to get back on track. And we can choose to have that hardened heart. We can choose to be stubborn, or we can choose to take advantage of the time. And this isn't, verse 10, this isn't an offer of eternal opportunity. It will come, and we need to seize the opportunity to repent, to soften our hearts, and to move forward. All right, that was a lot for the last 5 minutes, but we'll move on to chapter 11. And is it 11 and 12? And we'll finish up the Passover and that last plague next week. Thank you all.